Welcome back. We are entering our seventh and what could be the most important week of the impeachment inquiry. After 15 witnesses testified for more than 111 hours behind closed doors, we are now just 48 hours away from what could be game-changing public testimony. And here are the major questions you need to keep in mind as we enter this pivotal week. 1. Tomorrow, the White House is expected to release a call summary of the president's first phone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. So what will we learn from this new summary? 2. 3 current or former State Department officials are scheduled to testify publicly this week. How will their public testimony impact the debate around impeachment? And 3. How will the public testimony change the message that Democrats and Republicans are selling to us, the American people? These are the key questions we are keeping in mind as we enter what could be an historic week, and we will have the answers by the end of the week. Now, from the fight to try and get President Trump out of the White House, let's go to the race for it. The Democratic primary still reeling today from its most recent shakeup, when former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg submitted documents to meet Alabama's filing date to enter that state's primary. Now, new reporting says Bloomberg plans to skip the first 4 states, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, and instead focus on March 3rd. Known as Super Tuesday, where nearly a quarter of the primary delegates are up for grabs. Full disclosure, I worked for Bloomberg Media the 5 years prior to me joining NBC. Joining me now, staff writer for The Atlantic, Edward Isaac Duvar. Isaac, you posed a very interesting question. How much do votes cost? In past mayoral elections, we know Mike Bloomberg's strategy has been spend big, micro-target, and he won that way. Is that strategy scalable?
Well, we will see. They certainly seem to think it is. You go back to those mayoral elections, Bloomberg spent by the third time that he was running $102 million running for mayor of New York City. That came out to about $174 per vote that he got. They have since then, in the Bloomberg orbit, expanded to working in races for Senate, state legislature, as they were campaigning for people who were aligned with him on guns, on a number of other issues like the soda tax. So there is some experience in the Bloomberg orbit for going beyond New York City. Of course, it's not presidential level experience and it's not focused on him. But this is a man who thinks in terms of how much will it cost to win something, and is it worth that money? If he's getting into this race, he is running to win. We don't know for sure that he is going to get all the way in, but if he does, he will run to win, and he will presumably, according to what I've seen from him in the past when he was running for mayor and what his campaign advisors have been saying so far and told me on Friday, he will spend what it takes. Howard Wolfson said to me, Mike has a history of spending what it takes to win, and that's how he will think about this.
Isaac, I want you to stay with me, and let's bring in Chris Lu, former senior aide to President Obama and now a DNC superdelegate, and Darrell West, vice president and director of governance studies at the Brookings Institute. Chris, we've already got some polling on a Bloomberg potential run. A new Morning Consult poll already has him in 6th place with 4% nationally. Do you think he's a viable candidate?
I do think he's a viable candidate. Among the Democratic electorate, he has great credibility on issues like gun safety and climate change. You know, he's been one of the biggest funder of organizations and candidates on those causes and played a major role in flipping the Virginia legislature last year. And unlike other billionaires like Tom Steyer, like a Howard Schultz, he's run for office before. He's been battle-tested. He's held one of the toughest jobs in politics. I think the challenge, however, is that running for governor, running for mayor is significantly different than running for president of the United States. It requires organization and message and voter engagement. That being said...
But hold on a second.
Sure.
That's what any of us would say in any normal circumstance, but look who's in the White House.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I think Donald Trump showed in 2016 that you can run a different kind of race and get elected president. Donald Trump wasn't going to coffees and town halls in Iowa. He was doing big rallies. He was using his name recognition. And I think Bloomberg has a similar profile. And I think because of the uncertainty right now in the Democratic field, and a lot of these candidates are going to get to Super Tuesday without a lot of money, there's an opportunity for Bloomberg to jump in and make a big splash.
Darrell, Bernie Sanders already saying Mike Bloomberg cannot buy this election. Is that what this is about, buying this election? Because I spoke to advisors close to Mike over the weekend who said it's not Mike Bloomberg's #1 goal in life to be president of the United States, but given how much he cares about our planet, our future, his legacy, his grandchildren, and ours, he wants this guy out of office.
I mean, what money allows you to do is to control your own message. In the last report, Biden only had $8.9 million in cash on hand. As the previous report just indicated, Bloomberg is willing to spend $100 million, $200 million, or whatever it takes. And so he will be able to run ads, attack other candidates, defend himself. Voters actually like self-funded candidates because they view them as too rich to be bought. In an age of massive public cynicism, people actually like wealthy candidates.
But does that work? At the end of the day, Isaac, when you think about all those people who even wrote President Trump a $5 check or Bernie Sanders a $5 check, they end up engaged. They're part of it. If it's raining, sleeting, or hailing out on Election Day, they think they're part of the team. The fact that Mike Bloomberg's strategy is, I need no one, does that actually build a coalition?
Well, it did in New York, and Donald Trump accepted donations, as he said he was self-funding in 2016. He's, of course, accepting a lot of donations this time around for 2020. Mike Bloomberg has never accepted a donation, and that is the plan if he does go through with this run, that he would not accept a donation, and that would be a very much part of the pitch he would be making. He's beholden to no one that way. But you're right, it does not build the idea of a grassroots movement, which is the way that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have both responded to the idea of Bloomberg running, both of them touting how many donors they have. Elizabeth Warren and Sanders both over 1 million donors. I think Warren is at 2 million donors now. That is a different kind of campaign. But Mike Bloomberg would be running for not presumably any of the people who are voting for Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, but the rest of the party. That's about, depending on the polls, 55 to 60% of the party that's not with Sanders or Warren, and looking to consolidate a majority of that group. We'll see if he can do it. It did work in New York, although it should be pointed out, he ran as a Republican in New York because he couldn't win a Democratic primary in 2001 when he analyzed it. And then he ran, he switched over to be an independent. He wanted to run in 2008 as an independent. He wanted to run in 2016 as an independent. He couldn't see a path to the presidency that way. And then he changed to become a Democrat because that's the way that he thought that there was a path to the presidency.
Chris, to that very point, I interviewed Mike in August, and he said any of the Democratic candidates who are running would be better than President Trump. But Mike's new calculus is none of them could beat him in the general. What do you think of this, and what does that mean for Mike come the primary? Because we've seen centrist candidates like a Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden get beat up aggressively for not being more progressive.
Well, look, I think NBC's own polling shows that 85% of the Democratic electorate is satisfied with the candidates. But obviously, we're going to have a couple of months of really intensive campaigning with a lot of scrutiny, many more debates. And these candidates are going to emerge from those first four races either much stronger or significantly weaker. So it'll be interesting to see where the Democratic electorate is at that point. But what's important to understand, Stephanie, is this is ultimately all about delegates. And those first four early states have relatively small number of delegates. And so if he can sweep in here on Super Tuesday, he can actually start to garner a significant amount of support and make this interesting as we move to larger and larger states.
Chris, I want you to explain this just one more time, because Mike Bloomberg's strategy here is he's got the money to run a national campaign from day one, while he might not be showing up in Iowa. By the time the Iowa caucuses happen, early voting in California is already underway. Can you explain this one more time?
Well, it's exactly right. The first four early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, go. And then what happens is you have a successive series of Super Tuesdays. That first one is everything from California to Texas to Virginia, North Carolina. And really, in order to win the nomination, you need a majority of delegates. And so while there's an outsized attention to places like Iowa and New Hampshire, there are relatively few delegates. Now, a larger question should be seen. If you're Mike Bloomberg, a legitimate question should be asked. If you're trying to run for all Americans' votes, why you would skip the first four contests. So I would suggest this is a strategic decision, but he's going to be open to criticism for doing it.
He would answer, the answer is math, I'm guessing. Thank you all so much.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.